Всем привет, меня зовут Andrew Davis. Я буду говорить по-английски, чтобы не смущать себя. So I'm really happy to welcome you to CRM Stage 2021 and this session on DevOps for Salesforce. So I'm Andrew Davis, the Senior Director of Research and Innovation at Copado, also author of the book Mastering Salesforce DevOps. And so what I want to cover today are these 5 points. I want to talk about why do we need DevOps? And then second of all, how do you measure and visualize progress? And then third, what is continuous integration or CI? And then continuous delivery or CD? And then finally, how do we make progress in this practice? And first of all, I want to thank you. I don't necessarily know you. I don't necessarily know the details of what you do in your job, but I strongly suspect that you're involved in helping to create applications to help businesses run, either your own company or your customer's company. And there's an enormous amount of complexity that you're having to deal with to succeed in that. And I know very well the pain and the difficulty and the challenge that people have to go through to build these applications. And I just want to thank you very much for everyone's hard work. I do want to also let you know that there are a couple of Trailhead modules that cover these topics of DevOps. They're fairly quick and fairly simple modules, but hopefully they'll be a good introduction to these topics if you want to know more. So first of all, I want to cover why do we need DevOps? And this starts with you, and it starts with your job. Again, I don't know the details, but I strongly suspect that you have an important job. And I strongly suspect that your job has something to do with building applications to support your company or your customer's company. So what you're doing when you are building these applications is you are actually building the digital foundations for a business. And that is an extraordinary responsibility. It's an extraordinary opportunity as well. So you're on a development team, and this is a creative activity. It's a collaborative activity. And what you're doing is you're building an app. Let's say you're building a Service Cloud app to support a call center and agents there. So who's using your app? These are your, for example, Service Cloud users. But what are they doing? What's their role? Well, what they're doing is they're connecting with customers and they're helping customers, many, many customers a day. In fact, you've got many Service Cloud users who are connecting with many, many customers. And so directly or indirectly, the work that you're doing is affecting thousands, maybe millions or more end users or customers. And these are the people who are interacting with your business. You are actually directly or indirectly touching and the experience of so many people, thousands or millions of people. So these dev teams, like yourselves and your teams, you have an exponential impact because you're affecting so many people through these applications. So then the question is, if you look at what is the most important chain in this, or link in this chain, one of the most important certainly is this blue arrow in the center here, this connection. What is it that enables you as a development team to connect to the application that you're building, and how easy or difficult is it for you to roll out changes? And that's what's critically important here. Because you need good tools to do your job. You also need good processes and good information and so forth. But we'll spend some time in this session talking about the tools as a key aspect. Now, if you're familiar with Salesforce, as I'm assuming you are, you know that Salesforce has a ton of really cool capabilities for building applications, for building the data model and the underlying logic and the user interfaces and so forth. So Salesforce makes it easy to build. And easy is great, right? Everybody loves easy. But there are some limitations with easy. So the trouble with easy is that from easy means fast, and fast means more, and more means complex. So when you make something really easy for people, they can do a lot more of it, a lot more quickly. But when you get a lot more of anything, it becomes really quite, at least complicated, probably complex, a lot of moving parts. So the promise and the vision is that building on Salesforce is like building with Legos. You just compose these little small pieces and you put them together, and how hard could it be? And you'll just build yourself a Salesforce tower out of Legos like this. But in many cases, the orgs and the applications that we end up building on, they look a lot more like these Jenga towers, right? Where every little move that you make could possibly compromise the entire thing. And And it's hard to know in advance what the consequences could be of making a particular change. So I want to spell this out a little bit, and I want to make sure that we all have a clear sense of, at the foundations of what we're talking about, this development life cycle, if you want. The simplest and the most basic scenario is you have a Salesforce production org, and you just make stuff in that org, and you test it in that org, and then you release it to people all in that one production environment. And to the degree that you have sysadmins, or people with admin privileges, in production, making changes in production, that is exactly what they're doing. They're making new things, they're changing things, and they're testing it, of course, because you never get it right the first time, and then they're deploying it all to production. Well, actually, excuse me, you don't need to deploy it to production because it's already there in production. So you're building, testing, and deploying all in the same environment. Now, the risk with that is that there's an extraordinarily high risk of failures. Once you have people in that org using it, once you have sensitive business data and so forth, it's extraordinarily easy to break stuff. And when you break stuff in a production Salesforce org, you lose money, bad things happen, you corrupt the data, people yell at you. So there's social and financial consequences to this. And that's why this is bad option number one, is having no process. Now let's look at a second option here. The second option is you actually have sandboxes or development environments, and you separate out different environments for production, for testing, and for development. And this is a much more safe and a safe way to do things. It requires a bit of discipline. But the first thing you encounter when you move to this mode is that it's hard to deploy. It's literally just hard to take changes and move them from one environment to another. And if you have to deploy data, configuration data, test data, and manual, run scripts and these kinds of things, that all gets even harder. Now, what happens when you make something hard is the opposite of what happens when you make it easy, is that people do it infrequently. When something's hard, you do it as infrequently as you can possibly get away with. And so this is where you have infrequent deployments. And these infrequent deployments, what are the consequences of those? It means that when you do deploy, you have big deployments. And when you have a big deployment, what do you have? You have a high risk of failure. If you deploy 5 components, low risk of failure, and pretty easy to figure out what went wrong if you have a problem. If you deploy 5,000 components, you're basically guaranteeing that something is going to break in there. And it's also going to be extraordinarily hard to figure out exactly what it was that caused that problem. So to avoid that, what we do is we have these very complex coordination meetings and war rooms where we're all sort of planning the release. We work through the weekend, and long testing cycles to make sure that you've got all the people you need in place to review things. And what does that do? It makes the deployments even less frequent. It really makes the deployments a phenomenal pain in the butt. And so you do it as infrequently as you possibly can. Now, what's the consequence? That's one consequence. But what's the other consequence of this is when you're deploying infrequently, it takes a long time to get feedback. It could be days, weeks, months, 6 months or more before you actually find out whether people liked what you built and if there's any problems with it. And what that means is that you end up with poor quality because you're not able to get feedback from many people, maybe from a few people, not many early on. And the poor quality, we try to address that with long testing cycles and having these elaborate, user acceptance testing and so forth. And that just kicks into project delay, and you end up again with lost revenue and much badness. So this in turn is bad option number 2, is a slow process. No process, slow process. What are your options? So the first thing you need to do is to make your deployments easier. And that's the first thing you need to target to begin to remedy this situation. So this is getting into this concept known as the theory of constraints. And the theory of constraints has been very, very popular, very highly regarded and adopted as really a key set of ideas in the DevOps community. And the basic idea of the theory of constraints is that with any linear system, for example, there's always going to be one and only one constraint that is the primary limiter on the overall flow of work through that process. So a development process generally is organized as a linear system. So someone does the plans, someone else does the development, someone else does the testing and the deployments and so forth. And even if it's one person doing all of these jobs, it's still a somewhat linear process. So what is the slowest part in that whole process? That's your constraint. And what is the buggiest part in that process? That's your constraint on quality. So your speed can be constrained, your quality can be constrained. So the approach we take in theory of constraints is we try to identify what is the constraint, and then once we've identified it, we try to remove that constraint. And what happens is something else becomes the constraint. So there is no way to not have a constraint. There's always some constraint, but you can reduce and remove constraints, progressively by tackling different parts of your process. So what is it that we're actually trying to do again? Just to sort of make sure we're clear on this, if you imagine each of these little blue dots here was an idea, and your goal then is how many of these ideas can you realize and how many of these ideas can you bring into production or bring into reality. So your constraint initially when you first start developing may be a technology constraint. If you're just building custom Java apps for everything, there's a limitation to how quickly you can realize those ideas. And so what people do is they move to Salesforce, and Salesforce unblocks that creative capacity constraint. It unblocks that ability to realize ideas. And the next challenge you face is perhaps a skill constraint. And so you can go to Trailhead and you can improve your skills and get better at building on Salesforce. And maybe you have a team constraint because there's just a few of you, right? So what do? You hire a consulting company and they can come in and supplement your team. But at some point, you get to a process constraint where in fact it is your processes, whether you're a consulting company or a embedded company as part of an employee of a company, you have a process constraint, and that's where DevOps comes in. And DevOps is basically unblocking your processes. So the power of DevOps across huge range of technologies. Typically, you'll have the high or elite performers having as much as 200 or more times, 200 times or more frequent deployments, 100 times shorter lead times, far fewer change failure rates, far faster recovery time. A lot of industry research out there to back this up. So, what is DevOps again? So DevOps, it traces its roots back to 2009. There have been a lot of great books written about it, like the DevOps Handbook, which has just come out in a second edition. Brings together concepts like lean software engineering and transformational leadership and continuous delivery. But basically, it just means newer, better ways of building software compared to older, not so better ways, and really become incredibly vast and broad. The basic idea of dev versus ops, reconciling these two mindsets. Why would there ever be conflict between dev and ops? In the Salesforce world, we don't really even have ops. You don't have a network admin or network operations center in Salesforce, except for Salesforce, the company does. The reason there's a tension between these is that by definition, developers develop things. It means they create things, they build new things, they change things. And by definition, the role of operations people is to not break things. And so operations people naturally want things to be stable, because the thing that most often breaks things is when you change them. If you don't change it, it doesn't break, right? For the most part. So the devs want to change things and change them quickly, and the ops folks don't want to change things. And so you have a natural tension, just the laws of the universe, right? Laws of physics, put these folks in conflict. And so the point then is to find ways to reconcile these two needs and balance these two needs out. So that's DevOps in a nutshell, but we'll dig in a little bit. But I want to start with this first concept of measurement and visualization, this concept of making work visible. I showed earlier on these 4 metrics about how some of these high-performing teams greatly excel over these low-performing teams. And I mentioned these 4 metrics, and these 4 have come to be known as the 4 key metrics of DevOps, and you can read a lot about them in this book, Accelerate, which is a best-selling book on the topic. But the first 2 of these relate to the velocity at which you can roll out changes, and the latter 2 of these relate to the stability. So velocity means how long does it take you to roll changes out, and how often are you able to roll those changes out? How many deployments do you have? Now, if you have a lot of deployments, what that means is that each deployment is relatively small. And so frequent deployments and small deployments are basically synonymous, and infrequent deployments and large deployments are basically synonymous. So what happens when you make a deployment? Again, as I indicated, every time you deploy, there's a risk of breaking things. And so that's why many teams historically have wanted to not deploy very frequently, because you don't want to break things. So more frequently you deploy things, the more risk there is. So you want to reduce risk, so you deploy infrequently. But what happens, you have a very large deployment, there's a very high risk with that. So the challenge is, how do you reduce the risk of each deployment? And that's what's called reducing the change failure rate, the likelihood that every deployment will cause a failure. It's always going to be non-zero over time. If you take a long enough period of time, you will always get a non-zero failure rate. And that is everyone. And if you're a CIO, CEO, some fancy executive person, please hear this. There will always be a non-zero chance of failure, just because it's impossible to calculate all of the risks and consequences. So what becomes important if there is a failure is this last metric, this mean time to recovery. How quickly, if there is a failure, how quickly can the teams recover? And that speed of recovery is critically important. You want to keep that very, very fast. So yeah, there's a failure. We fixed it in 45 minutes. Great. Fantastic. Next best thing compared to not having a failure in the first place. So these 4 key metrics, if you can excel in these, you can be fast, you can roll out lots of change very quickly from the development teams, and you can be stable and reliable. And if there's a problem, you can roll it back very quickly. And those are basically the 2 key characteristics that any development team needs. So when we did some analysis at Copado, we created what's known as the State of Salesforce DevOps report. We've done a couple of versions of this, and soon to do a 3rd version. We found that there are elite, high, medium, and low performing teams, and we see the same distribution in the Salesforce development world that we see in the traditional software development world, like Java, Node.js, and Python apps, and so forth. The teams that really excel across all of these metrics, and the teams that really struggle, they struggle on all of these metrics. And so there is the possibility of improving. In fact, you need to improve both of these together. So one of the main things that we found is that when we interviewed these companies, we found there was a strong correlation between the likelihood for larger teams, where there was a larger team building on Salesforce. What we found was that there's a very high correlation between teams that did well in software delivery and teams where their company as a whole was doing well. And so, there could be many explanations for this. If your company's doing well, maybe you can pay more to hire, more talented people. Of course, that's one possibility. But there's another key aspect, which is that to the extent that you are building your company on digital systems like Salesforce, your ability to change those systems quickly, easily, without breaking things, is a critical capability for your organization to be able to function effectively. So it's not a one-way relationship, but we can say that this is a core and key capacity that organizations need to be able to function effectively, and it can help your entire company if you optimize for these processes. I want to talk about Salesforce development first of all. very briefly. And all I want to say is I'm not going to talk about Salesforce development. There's a lot of other sessions at this conference where you can learn about Salesforce development. I'm going to talk to you about all the stuff that's in between and that doesn't get talked about, such as architecture. Sometimes architecture is an afterthought. A lot of good quotes here. This on the bottom right, most architectures are accidental, not intentional. So architecture means looking at the systems that you're building from a larger scale, in terms of the larger system, in terms of longer periods of time, in terms of a broader set of concerns like maintainability and security and so forth, overall total cost of ownership. These kinds of considerations are what you need skilled architects to assist with and advise with, and it is a level of concern that we don't always have if we're just down in the weeds. And so when we look at architecture, good architecture is the foundation for being able to deploy quickly and deploy safely and have very testable code and make things easy to change. And so architecture is really a critically important foundational capability that all teams need to get good at. And there's a lot of aspects to architecture, but I want to talk about this one, tight coupling versus loose coupling. So tight coupling is the idea that you've got a lot of different components, but they're very tightly connected with each other. So you get tight coupling at many different scales. On the level of one piece of code, you have what's called spaghetti code, where it's just endless lines, and this references this, and not at all easy to understand. On the level of multiple classes and so forth in your code, then tight coupling is where these classes are directly calling each other, which is very normal and common, but it does have some limitations, does have some challenges. And the final kind of tight coupling is what's almost universal in Salesforce, is that Salesforce is one big integrated database. And so almost invariably, when you're building on Salesforce, you're all touching the same database. And so all of your applications become very tightly interdependent on each other. And so that's this challenge of untangling and modularizing your Salesforce org. So here's an example of loose coupling. And this slide is also making me hungry, so don't feel bad if that's your main reaction. But the idea of pizza versus spaghetti, right? Pizza's loosely coupled, spaghetti's tightly coupled. On a code level, it might be object-oriented design or functional programming with a strong emphasis on a lot of individual methods that are all self-contained. Modular architecture, and there's a couple of more advanced capabilities like dependency injection and event-based programming and using event streams and so forth that can be huge aids towards getting this modularity. So architecture is the basic foundation. Now I want to get into the things that most people think about as DevOps, right? It's not what you're building, it's how you're building it and how you're deploying it and how you're testing it. It's all of the hows related to development as opposed to the what. So continuous integration, I want to start first of all with this topic of version control. So when I started adopting version control in Salesforce, pretty good long while ago, 2014, 2015, something like that, it was not at all common. It was not common at all to see people using version control in Salesforce. It's a lot more common these days. And it's getting, sort of tipping over towards having, gradually having the majority of big Salesforce implementations using version control, hopefully all of them. If you're wondering how to get started in version control, this slide just kind of giving some thoughts on the benefit of defensive version control versus offensive version control. This is a term that I learned early on. Defensive version control is a very simple passive way of just capturing snapshots of the metadata. So having a way to capture snapshots means that you can, it just means that you at least have some fallback. It's like a safety net. Now, offensive or active version control, this means where you're actively and intentionally tracking the changes that you're making as you're doing them. And that's, of course, what you really need to be doing and moving towards. So I'm just trying to encourage you that there may be easy ways to baby steps into this world of version control. So this term continuous integration, or CI, gets thrown around a lot and not necessarily well understood, not necessarily very well practiced, and misinterpreted and so forth. But basically, the idea with continuous integration is that software is a miracle, right? Software is an amazing miracle. And one of the miracles of software is that you can have different developers work in parallel to one another. So I can have my version of the software and you can have your version of the software, and we can both work on the exact same software, the exact same code, config, whatever else, in parallel without interfering with each other. Now, if you try doing that, if you're redecorating a room, you can't be painting the room and moving the furniture around at the same time. You have to do one or the other, right? Software, you can have different environments with identical copies of the work. And so that's amazing, the ability to work in parallel. And you can have 2, 4, 8, 16, hundreds of developers and entire teams working in parallel with one another. That's a miracle. It's great. But they've all got to come back together at some point, right? You and I have to merge our code at some point, right? And the two big teams, they've got to merge their code. And the longer you go without merging, the rougher that merge is going to be, and the more painful and the more difficult it's going to be. And so the easiest way to do continuous integration is just have everybody in one development sandbox. But that's a little bit too close, a little bit too tight. You break each other, especially if there's a lot of people in there. So if you've got multiple different environments, how do you merge them regularly? And when I say regularly, I mean daily. And continuous integration means that you're merging your work at least daily. If you're not merging your work daily, you're not actually doing continuous integration. Continuous integration has almost nothing to do with tools like Jenkins and so forth. Those things are extraneous. It's the practice of merging. And the only way to merge effectively and frequently is using version control. So that's why I mentioned version control at the start, because you can't merge regularly without version control. So version control enables continuous integration, but it is a discipline. And the next thing that continuous integration points towards is testing, as I'll show you in a second. But you can think of continuous integration as this sweet spot where if you're actually in the same environment, it can be inefficient and unpredictable, people changing things or having to wait for each other. If you don't merge more frequently, it's too inefficient. So this brings you to the topic of quality and testing. So when you think about what people requested, it's like the tip of the iceberg. But what you build is this whole body of the iceberg. And so we can think about quality in these two levels. So quality has functional quality. Do things do what they're supposed to do? But it also has structural quality. Have you built things the right way? And when you look at structural quality, this is often what and so when we think about testing, what are we doing with testing? We are assessing quality. And testing can be checking functional quality, checking whether something does what it's supposed to do. And that's what you do typically when you do manual testing or user acceptance testing, and some kinds of unit tests and some kinds of UI tests are also functional testing, making sure that things work well. But there's also these other kinds of testing or quality checks, reliability, just work consistently over time. Security, have you checked for security risks and permissions, performance? Do you have, and performance, of course, has two aspects as well. There's performance at scale. If you have a ton of data, how does your code work with large data volumes, for example? But it also, performance can mean this micro performance, like what is the responsiveness of a page, and how long is a user waiting as part of their interactions and so forth. The maintainability is the long-term ease of maintaining the system. Of course, this is where you have this built-in Salesforce functionality versus custom code. Built-in functionality is a lot more maintainable, comparing one-to-one comparison. And then size, the bigger bigger things are, the harder they are to manage the quality. So now you're an expert in version control, continuous integration, testing. If you're not an expert, go back, rewind a couple of minutes and listen to that again. And if you get those basic points that I mentioned, you've got a lot of understanding. It's good understanding. But there's another topic that's really popular in this space: continuous delivery, or CD. Now, CD deals with, so I guess just to introduce this concept of configuration drift. So configuration drift sounds like a fancy term, but it just means if you take two identical things and you give them enough time and distance, they become very, very different, right? Whether those are twins, you've got twins, they're biologically identical when the cells first split. Over time, over the years, they become more and more different and so forth. In the Salesforce world, we're talking about sandboxes, and sandboxes that start as copies, identical copies of production. But over time, the longer they live, the more different they become. And that was the revolutionary power of introducing scratch orgs, and we're still in the early stages of learning how to adopt scratch orgs. But the idea with scratch orgs, you just cut you destroy the org at least every 30 days. And by destroying the org, you force teams to cut this configuration drift. If you are a carpenter in a wood shop and your job is making furniture and so forth, the main thing you're doing is you're creating furniture. But there's something else that's happening as you're working, which is you're accumulating a lot of sawdust and a lot of scraps of wood all over the place, right? And so your workshop gradually becomes very cluttered. And that same thing happens with our development environments and our testing environments. If we don't recreate them periodically or refresh them periodically, they get more and more and more different. And so the actual number of differences between these dev and test environments compared to production grows and grows and grows. So the key with continuous delivery is to synchronize these changes as quickly as possible. The idea with continuous integration is to synchronize changes between different developers as quickly as possible, and that's on the left-hand side of this diagram. The idea with continuous delivery is to synchronize these upstream environments, testing and production environments, with development, so that none of them are getting too far out of sync at any given time. Again, with continuous delivery, there's this sweet spot where again, if you delay the deployment of things for days, weeks, months, years, there are enormous inefficiencies that arise because you're not getting that feedback that you need from the end users. And so they continue to struggle. So this is actually a screenshot from inside of Copado. It's just showing the power being able to visualize what you're doing. So with these slides, I've tried to visualize some of these abstract concepts. You maybe have never seen a visualization of configuration drift before, right? I'm trying to explain abstract concepts in a way that you can see them, and that's the number one problem in the software world, is that everything's invisible. And so to be able to introduce visibility to our development environments, the flow of work, the progress of success or failure of different deployments and so forth, is incredibly powerful, right? So I want to talk a little bit about, I've introduced DevOps. It would be a little bit incomplete if I didn't talk about ops, the ops part of it. The key to Salesforce ops is to know that Salesforce does most of it for you. And that's in fact why people pay Salesforce a lot of money, so that you don't have to wear the pager. So you don't have to be tracking, specific attacks on the infrastructure. You don't have to be keeping track of, network bandwidth usage and so forth. So Salesforce admins mostly work as click-based developers. They sometimes do some real, admin type work, but often they're just click-based creative developers. So one of the main roles for Salesforce developers, that they're a bit closer to the end users. And so that's often a characteristic An admin might be helping to address some immediate user needs. Something breaks. They may be an early layer of escalation if you have a support department. And so that level of communication between the admins and the users is critically important, right? And ideally, the developers also have strong communication, but it really depends on the size of your team. But you want to reduce the barriers to information flow. You want to reduce the barriers to information flowing from your users to your admins and developers. But the key thing is that the admins often well, let me put it this way. If you're writing code in Salesforce, you can't write code in production. It's literally not possible, not allowed. The only way you can get code into Salesforce is to write it in another environment and deploy it into production, and they force you to run these unit tests, right? So Salesforce is trying to help developers to develop some rigorous process to adopt, instead of not having any process, to have a formal process for deployments. Now, admins are not forced to go through that same process. So you can edit a flow directly in production. You can edit workflow rules, you can edit the database and so forth directly in production. Should you? No, you should not. No, you should not. And you can quote me on this. You should definitely not edit these things in production if you have real users who are using that system, because there's a high risk of failure and things are going to break and not good things are going to happen. And you're not going to have a history of how things used to be. Because if you're not using version control, you don't have any visibility into what things used to be. So one of the key things we need to do is to force admins to follow a regimented development lifecycle, just like developers have to follow that. But of course, if admins are going to be happy about that, and if they're going to be effective in their job, you have to make that development pipeline easy, quick, reliable, safe. You need to make that process as smooth as it could possibly be. There needs to be a good user experience in following the development lifecycle. And if there's not, you're going to get unhappy people. But to the degree that you can make that process smooth, you can get a lot of very happy people who can be very effective, making things better in a safe way. Now, when you hear me say things like, don't let people make changes in production, and you need to learn new things like continuous integration and so forth. So we're starting to get into this realm of doing things differently than the way we used to. And this is, there's a formal name for this: organizational change management. How do we enable change management? Change management for an individual is called learning. That's the technical term for change management as an individual. When you get a whole bunch of people, like a development team or all the Salesforce admins and developers together to learn, that's called change management. Now, one of the really, really important things to know about change management, if you look at this graph on the left-hand side, this bell curve, what this is saying is that people change at different rates, or they have different levels of enthusiasm for change in certain areas. So there are certain areas of your life where you're an innovator. Maybe you're an innovator in the kitchen. You try things that nobody's ever experimented with before. Great, but you may or may not be an innovator in the software development process. But you'll have some people who are willing to sort of go ahead a little bit and try things out and explore things. And then once they've proven it out, they can share it with others who can become early adopters of that. So that's the way it can work in your organization. You can have one team that pilots the use of something like Copado as a tool to ease the development lifecycle, and then have other teams to look at that and consider maybe adopting that also for themselves. And gradually, you need to get more and more and more people to adopt these tools and these processes, the early majority, the late majority. Eventually, you're going to have some people who won't change unless they're forced to change. And at some point, you just have to lock them out and say there's only one way to to make changes to this org. Now, there's something shown in this diagram called the chasm. And this is a concept from an author named Geoffrey Moore, who wrote a book called Crossing the Chasm. And the idea here is that there's a real difference in the personality style of the people who are on the left there versus the people who are on the right. The people who are on the left, they want the fastest, best way of doing things. And I can say that in the Salesforce DevOps space, I was kind of on this left side, the innovator or early adopter, wanting to learn the best ways of doing this. And you need people like that who kind of learn new ways of doing things, and that's great. But that's not going to convince the majority of people to do things in that way. What the majority of people are looking for, they're looking for safety in numbers. They're looking for indications that they can adopt that new way of working, not because it's necessarily the fastest or the best. That's not their main concern. They're looking to adopt it because they want to be successful and seen socially as successful like other people were. They want to avoid risk and problem, but they need a lot of examples. And so the change management process goes from being, prototyping and figuring out what's the best way to do things to storytelling. And if you really want to get a movement to take hold in an organization, you need to get good at telling stories. And so I'm packing a lot of information to this one slide. I'm packing a lot of information into this whole presentation, but this 8-step process from John Kotter is talking about this process of how to enable change across an organization. And some of this is storytelling, creating a vision for change, communicating the vision, and then empowering action, helping others to feel comfortable, and then creating quick wins, helping them to have easy ways to adopt this, and then building on the change and helping to make it stick and really enforcing this over time. So this takes some skill. And just because you're really good at setting up a DevOps pipeline doesn't necessarily mean you're really good at storytelling or organizational change management. So this is where you need to bring other people together and talk about it within your organization and think about this, not just in technical terms, but think about it also in social terms, how we work together. Communicate well and be bold and have fun. And that's the key, right? Because you're doing awesome stuff. Your job's important and you need to make your job easier. You need tools that make your job easier. You need processes that make your job easier. You're really building the digital foundations that are the infrastructure, the underlying support for the entire organization, and your activities and the apps that you're building are affecting thousands or millions of people. So it's important to do well, but it's important to, have fun in the process, but you need experimentation, and that's where the being bold comes in. So you're not going to get it right the first time. You're not going to understand everything the first time, right? But this is a learning journey for you, and it's a learning journey for the organization. But you have to do it, right? Like, our organizations are under so much pressure and to perform from one point of view, but also we're under pressure internally that we don't want to waste our lives, right? You don't want to waste your life. You don't want to be doing things at work that are not effective or not important or wasting your time, right? So we need to learn how to be effective in these things. So in conclusion, I'd love to do a shameless self-promotion of this book. If you want to know more about this, you can look at this book, Mastering Salesforce DevOps. I'm really delighted to have had a chance to spend time with you here today, and I wish you the very best in this big adventure. Thank you so much.